The following conversation on Talking with Guy. I'm Guy, your host, and today I'm with Becky Malamut. We're going to talk about dam restorations, her work at North-South River Watershed Association, and dive into the cost of it, whether the dam gets breached, and the benefits of restoring it for the local habitat, and how that sometimes aesthetic might not be the only reason to keep the dam. Sometimes bringing things to how it was will help our planet heal for a better tomorrow.
That's good. For a better tomorrow. I loved it. Planet heal for a better tomorrow. Very good.
Yep.
Start a whole series just on that.
And today on Better Tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Today on Better Tomorrow. I love it. I love it.
Thank you for coming in.
Sure.
What's up, everybody who's watching? Can you describe your role as a river restoration coordinator?
Generally, I manage all of our river restoration projects that we work on with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. Right now, we have a few projects along the South River in Duxbury and Marshfield that we're working on. We have two along the Indian Head River and one along Third Herring Brook. So all of these projects are different phases, and so I oversee all of the different parties that are part of the project, whether it's consultants and engineers, dam owners who are typically, or often the towns, sometimes they're private owners. And I also do a lot of education and outreach to residents so they can understand the projects that we're working on, why we want to implement them, pros, cons, costs, things like that, especially when it comes to public dam removals or dams that are owned by the towns. The residents typically make the decision about whether or not to remove the dam, so it's important that they have all the information they need.
How do you evaluate the success of a restoration?
So specifically, our goal is to reconnect the rivers to restore habitat. When you build a dam on a river, it disconnects those habitats. It turns a free-flowing river into a series of ponds. And a lot of these dams, or most of these dams in this area, were built to support industries along the rivers. Those industries haven't existed for 100 years or so. So where our goal is to remove the dams to allow fish to be able, primarily migratory fish, to be able to get back up the river from the ocean, up the river to their spawning grounds, and also just to allow other fish and species that live in the oceans to have a more suitable habitat. So we evaluate the success of the dam removal projects through looking at the fish that come back and the animals that come back. Primarily, we plant on the river banks. When you remove a dam, you take this impoundment or pond behind a dam, and it turns into a river channel. So you have some exposed land that becomes a vegetated wetland, and we typically will plant native species there. So we'll look to make sure that those species have stayed and have taken root, and that invasives haven't been able to get in. And those are the primary ways to evaluate the success of the dam removal.
I imagine some of the dams are kind of there for like they were built a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And removing those dams, would that impact the new environment, like the new habitat that has been established, because of the water is flowing differently, new species or new things coming into the area?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and is actually something we've heard a lot from residents throughout the process that we've been working on for the Indian Head River. So we're looking at potentially removing the State Street Dam, which borders Hanson and Hanover, as well as the Leddens Ford Dam, which borders Pembroke and there has been concern, because there are a lot of ponds in this area, so there has been concern about, what happens to, there's a species of river herring that is more conducive to living in the warmer ponds versus the colder fresh water, free-flowing water. And the response is, these impoundments, these ponds behind the dams, they're not natural. They weren't there initially. And as a result, the fish that are native to that area can no longer survive in that stream. So those kind of pond-loving fish will find other ponds in the area and in the system where they can live and they can thrive. And some may not, some won't survive it. But that's one species versus many other species that were intended to live in these free-flowing rivers.
How did you get involved with this project, or was this like a career goal?
Yeah. So I have a background in environmental policy and outreach and freshwater resources. So I have volunteered with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association for years. I've been a herring counter. And what that is that in different areas all over the watershed, people sign up to count herring below obstructions, either below a fish ladder, typically, to count how many fish are below the fish ladder and how many fish get up the fish ladder. And that helps us understand if these fish ladders are actually effective in passing fish. Mm-hmm. So a fish ladder, you'd see it at Ledden's Ford Dam. There's a really big one, Ledden's Ford Park. And it's, fish can't jump over a dam, right? But so you create these fish ladders or these structures that make it a little bit easier in theory for the fish to get upstream so they can get to their spawning habitat. So it's a great way for people to get involved and for people to understand kind of the plight of migratory fish and for us to understand what areas need the most help. I've done that for years. I live in Scituate, never seen a herring below or above the fish ladder, but we're really working to restore that first herring brook. Let's see. I worked I was a sustainability consultant for food service for years. And then, this opportunity arose with the Watershed Association. Like I said, I've known Executive Director Samantha Woods for years, and our previous ecologist. So, we just spoke. They had this opportunity. They got funding through the Natural Resources Damages Fund to do what's called a feasibility study along the Indian Head River. They needed somebody to oversee that, so that's when I started to get involved. And then a few months later, some additional funding came in through an anonymous grant, and I've been able to now oversee all of the river restoration projects, not just the...
What is like a typical timeline for for the Indian, like if everything goes out smoothly? So what's like a typical time?
So there really isn't one, but it's years. It's a very long process. The actual dam removal process takes a couple of weeks. It's been at least 7 years since this project was conceived. And we completed the feasibility study last year, which tells us, is dam removal possible without increasing flooding or hurting infrastructure? What kind of sediment needs to be dealt with behind the dams, which is a really big issue along the Indian Head River? What is the cost, potential cost, things like that, so you can kind of go further along in the process. Once you know it's possible, then you put more resources towards the actual nuts and bolts of it. Mm-hmm. So we're on a great trajectory, and then the potential Superfund designation came up at the same time as our feasibility study was wrapping up. So it will be years before, especially Ledden's Ford, will be dealt with, because we now really need to wait and see what happens with that Superfund designation and what the plan will be for the fireworks site upstream. The Watershed Association, before I joined or started working for the association, removed 3 dams from the third herring brook. And that, I think, was a 15 to 20-year process from start to end. I think, based on conversations I've had with other people who've been doing this for years and years, that's more the typical timeline from true, conception of the project to dam removal. Could be 10 years. It could be 15 years. But again, the actual process of dismantling the dam is just a few weeks.
Just out of curiosity, is there a way to design a dam that does not impact, the fish migration, or for example, make a tunnel or something?
Yeah, no, because the point of a dam is to hold water back for some reason, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were to create a hole in it, you're just going to let the water out. It wouldn't have it wouldn't be effective as a dam if your goal is to hold the water back. So there really isn't. Now there are dams that are necessary, whether it's for power or for flood control. The dams that we have in Massachusetts, we have 3,000 dams in Massachusetts. About 2,800 of those are not used for flood control, are not used for power. They were used either for recreation or for or to support these industries that no longer exist. So some dams do have a purpose, but we've spent years with the Industrial Revolution just damming our waterways to support the beginning of that era. And now it's time to dismantle the ones that are no longer needed and kind of get the the rivers back to their natural.
Given the name Indian Head, I'm assuming that there's like probably in the area.
Mm-hmm.
Does that comes to factor when okay, let's create a project? Does that come to factor of should we take account of like the locals and the native, or is it like only the locals? Who decisions weighs?
So typically you engage as many stakeholders as possible and who would be part of the decision-making process. So in the case of the Indian Head River, the dams are owned by the towns. We are working to establish and create a partnership and a relationship with the Mitigation tribe, which is a more local tribe. And then the consulting team that we worked with who completed the feasibility study, part of their team was a representative from the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe on the Cape. And she was able to provide suggestions in terms of appropriate plantings, some historical background, things of that nature. The further we get in the process, the more I hope we are able to involve the Matakeesit as well as the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe if that kind of consulting relationship continues. There is, when you go through the permitting process, there's something called a Section 106 permit, I believe, that requires working with any local or native, any local tribes. We have a small steering committee currently that is made up of the Watershed Association, a representative from DEP, who's provided the funding through that Natural Resources Damages Fund I mentioned, 3 appointed members from the towns, and we hope to expand that as we get further down the line and get closer to actual decisions to be made about removing the dam, and that there would be more representation beyond just this. And then also, as part of the feasibility study, we do a archaeological review. There are a couple of third parties that we contract with to do that. And a major part of that in this area is looking at native history. It's not just looking at the industrial history. It's understanding how dam removal could impact any remaining artifacts, if there are burial sites, burial grounds in the area, how you would need to manage construction and access around those. So it's definitely part of the process. And there are some codified parts, as I mentioned, with the permitting. We're trying to create partnerships so that it is more a part of the process from the beginning and not just something you do towards the end. As I said, as many stakeholder voices can be represented and heard in order to help make truly the best decision for that site.
Would removing the dam kind of impact the water quality?
Yeah, definitely. So it typically improves water quality, right? Because you're taking these impoundments or ponds, people refer to them. When you do that, the water temperature rises. With higher water temperatures, you can get increased algae. You get decreased what's called dissolved oxygen, which helps fish maintain natural balance in the water. Also, sediment can build up behind the dams, and that can contaminate. Add contamination to the water. So by removing those dams, you're allowing that sediment to move through the system. Naturally occurring sediment, not necessarily contaminated sediment, which we talk a lot about, especially behind Lennon's Ford Dam and upstream at the fireworks site. So you move that sediment through the system instead of letting it build up by, again, removing the dam. Those temperatures drop and you get cooler water. And so that decreases algae. It just makes it a much more hospitable place for plants that are meant to live there.
How long does it typically take over for prior to the dam existing, to just recover?
To come back?
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the fish, typically you will see fish back in the next migratory season. Just anecdotally from what I understand from other people who've worked again on other dam removal projects and studies that I've read, that they see fish come back very quickly. Sometimes I've read some studies where dam removals in the Midwest, and things like mussels sometimes take longer to come back. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's not something that we deal with here in these rivers. Vegetation will take a little while. So at first, once the dams are removed, I mentioned those now exposed riverbanks. For the first few months, they'll be muddy. And then probably within the next season, within the next year, you'll start to see the vegetation grow. So usually within a year, you'll start to see everything come back. And very often, with more fish come more birds, with more muskrats and otters and all sorts of different animals that we might not have seen in that area in a while, that you might not be expecting to come back, but will because the whole ecosystem is connected.
So I know like when it rains around here, some parts floods.
Great question.
How is, because I don't know much about dams, but I know when a dam is placed somewhere, some part of the river or where the water is shrinks a little. Would that have an impact on anybody who's like on new settlements that like build alongside the rivers, or how do I say? Would that have an impact on overall? Like, would there be a change in like? Because we already get floods, so
Right.
I was like, would it be more floods or less floods, or it's kind of like roll the dice and let's see what happened after?
No, that's a huge reason to remove some of these dams. There's this great quote from an article, I think it was in the New York Times, maybe almost a year ago, that we've got 19th century infrastructure, 20th century laws, and 21st century climate. You know, these dams were not built to sustain or withstand today's climate, the severe weather that we're getting in the summer with Leominster, and who knows what dam will be next to breach. So what happens when floodwaters rise around a dam, it doesn't necessarily initially topple the dam. It usually goes around the sides of the dam and kind of breaks down the front of the dam, and eventually the dam will topple. We have seen water coming around Leddens Ford Dam at some of the larger storms. So it's definitely a concern that dam won't be able to withstand future climate. And if that were to occur, you know, all of that contaminated sediment behind it will wash down the river. There will be, there aren't a ton of homes in the area that could be affected. We don't really know. But there's a bridge right downstream that could be affected by a major breach. There are properties that could be affected. Similarly with the State Street Dam, so State Street is it's right in front of the State Street Bridge. And it's really a series of rocks and boulders strewn across the river versus the one at Leddens Ford, which is a large concrete structure. And the one at State Street already has two areas of breach. There's two sections in the middle where the water just flows right through it. So it's kind of a foregone conclusion that that's going to breach sooner than later because it's small as it is and it's already breached. What happens when you remove those dams is that you and then create that natural river channel, and then you have the river banks, exposed banks. Those banks are able to naturally absorb flood waters, and it creates additional flood storage. So by putting these rivers back into their more natural state, you're actually decreasing the risk of flooding. That's a huge reason why we're trying to do some of this now before it's too late. We're able to do it in a controlled, engineered, scientific way versus waiting for Mother Nature to just blow these dams out.
Nice. Well, not nice, but but yeah. Is there any way that anybody who is like a local resident or some like to kind of help around with the projects or volunteer?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, the biggest thing people can do, I think, because we've seen it work very recently, is if river restoration is important, if this idea of reconnecting the river is a vision you see for your community, I highly encourage people to reach out to their select boards and let them know. Right now there aren't decisions to be made, but there will be in the future. And I think the more the select boards kind of understand and kind of take the temperature of residents before there's a decision to be made, the better. Follow along on your town's select board and conservation commission agendas when they have these conversations. We have two projects on the South River, one in Marshfield and one in Duxbury, that are going through the permitting process, so people can, again, check agendas to see when these projects will come about. Veterans Memorial Park Dam as well as the Temple Street Dam. And then become a member or join or follow watershed associations, your local watershed association. So in this area, for anything that's, so the Indian Head River is a tributary of the North River. Third Herring Brook is a tributary as well. So any of those, find your local watershed association, find out who's protecting, restoring those rivers, and then see what you can do to help, how you can spread the word. You may be sharing their posts on social media. We have we started a social media campaign in September, hashtag Let Our Rivers Flow, where we've provided a lot of education around dam removals and river restoration, a lot of case studies. We're going to be talking about culverts and hydrology of rivers this spring. So there's a lot people can do just by getting informed and sharing that information with your networks, as well as, like I said, reaching out to your local representatives.
Do you guys have like work closely with the
Yeah, so in different ways, right? So DEP has this funding stream for the Indian Head River projects because it was part of a bankruptcy settlement around the fireworks site. So we work closely with them on these two projects because they're the funder at this stage. EPA not as much because our rivers aren't federal rivers, but in terms of the Superfund site designation, we've been in contact with the EPA. We've had some great conversations with them. They know the work that we're trying to do. And so that will continue to be an ongoing relationship and partnership. There's a lot of work with the DER, Division of Ecological Restoration at the state level, where they provide funding, they provide oversight. They have what they call a priority projects list. The projects along the South River have been designated a priority for DER, so they provide a lot of both technical and financial support as well.
Do you at the? I know I'm gonna mess this up, but North, South River Restoration.
Watershed Association.
Watershed Association.
3 of the 5.
Yeah. Do you like after restoration is done? So like 5 years, like post restoration. How do you guys like keep check with the river, or I don't know how you guys interact with it, or it's like okay, river's done.
We're
to
out
the
of
next.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So there's typically a full year of post-construction monitoring where we look at things like the invasives, we look at the fish, we look to make sure the channel is doing what the engineers wanted them to, anticipated doing through the dam removal. And then after that, one of the biggest ways we stay on top of these are our herring counts, is having citizen scientists, volunteers come out to the rivers, go to certain points to see if they see herring, any other fish in the river, which way it's swimming, how many of them there are, and that can really help us show and track the way that these habitats are coming back and the way that the species are coming back. So that's how we've been doing it. The 3 on the Third Herring Brook are the first 3 that the Watershed Association removed. So this is a relatively, we're doing more and more of it. But I know in other watersheds, there've been a number of dams removed on Town Brook in Plymouth, a number on the Jones River in Kingston. I mean, it's happening all over the state and the country too. So one of the biggest ways we do that is to do the herring counts, and then also we'll go check the rivers, make sure that there isn't any debris that needs to be cleaned, that there aren't any issues. So that's a lot of the work that our staff scientist does, as well as our group of citizen scientists. We have volunteers around the watershed who help with those types of projects.
What are citizen scientists?
Citizen scientists. So those are people who volunteer to do things like count herring. They do a lot help with, we have our salt marsh sentinels, who are people who have docks on the marshes, who are able to help us understand how water levels are changing around the salt marshes. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. There's some water quality monitoring. So it's basically a way of empowering regular people who aren't scientists and don't have a science background to be able to help and gather data that we can then use in the Watershed Association to identify projects, understand effectiveness of projects we've already worked on, things like that.
Nice. It's like a community.
Yeah.
Like, come help us.
Exactly.
Nice.
So it's a pretty common model. We see it a lot in Massachusetts. I mean, in this area, and I'm sure nationwide. But yeah, it's a way of kind of creating an army of local scientists.
Since India Head is more relevant to like the community of Whitman and Hanson, how do you what's a like a rebuttal that you would have with someone that oppose? Like it's always been this way, or I don't know what opposition that you can face.
Yeah.
But what is one of those rebuttals that you can the benefits that they can see from the dam is removed?
Yeah, I think not like a rebuttal, but even before we started the feasibility study, I went around to all of the relevant boards and committees and to a couple of local community groups to just educate people about dams and how many there are in Massachusetts and how many don't serve the purpose that they intended and what those impacts are in the river. Like we've talked about, that migratory fish, like our river herring and our shad, can't get upstream to spawn. And how it changes water temperatures, how it changes water quality, how it traps sediment. And I think that once people see all of that and think, is it really worth keeping this pond versus a free-flowing river? We're not taking away the water. We're not building a building. or just changing it from a stagnant pond into a free-flowing river. And I think a lot of people, I've actually kind of seen it in their eyes and then have had conversations with people afterwards, realize, no, this is a much better solution for the success of the habitat and the ecology, not just my aesthetic, right? In a case like these two, that really the only benefit is the aesthetic benefit of the pond. And as you mentioned earlier, that there are some fish, or there's at least one species of fish that live in the pond specifically. But when you look at the benefits across the board of dam removal, it's really hard to say like, well, the aesthetics are more important than the health of the river. And I'm sorry, one more thing. I mean, the climate change and the flood control is also huge. I mean, we, especially after a summer like we had last, or a year like we had last year with the amount of rain and severe weather, like just intense storms, these dams are going to breach. And if we don't take them down in a methodical, scientific way, it could be a disaster. Also, any damages that would result from a breach, the towns are liable, the dam owner is liable for those damages. So in the case of the Indian Head River, those are the towns. Now, towns have insurance, but that doesn't cover everything. There was just a really interesting article in the Globe about Leominster and how these flood impacts from these local severe storms, they're not covered by FEMA because they're too small. And so the towns and the residents and the state has to pay for the cleanup for these floods, and that's only going to become more and more common. So that's another huge argument. I mean, you just can't deny that climate is changing, and to keep these dams for aesthetics versus potentially protecting homes and properties and infrastructure. I mean, if you don't do it for the health of the river, at least do it for the health of the people and the structures.
So would it, like, for example, if a dam got breached and then disaster, would that impact like tax and the economy of like of the town, or?
I think it would depend on the scale of the damage. That's my best answer. Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, towns have insurance. Mm-hmm. So if the damages were big enough that they needed that didn't cover it, they probably would, they potentially would need to increase taxes, or, I'm not exactly sure how that would work. But I know it's a big deal out in Leominster right now, trying to find and pay for it.
Well, I feel like nice is the different filler word I need to use. Yeah. Is there anything that you want to kind of? I know Indian Head River is not the only dam that you're focused on right now. The other two?
So there are three projects, two that are in the permitting process along the South River that we're permitting, working to get funding for. We did receive a grant for one of them, and we'll continue to apply for more grants. We try to, a lot of participants in funding these projects. They're really big projects that affect communities at large. So those two are exciting because they're moving, again, along the South River. In both cases, the Indian Head River and the South River, the dams that we're looking at are the first dams up from the ocean, which means that will be no more impediments between fish coming from the ocean to go to their spawning grounds. So, as you can start to reconnect the river kind of from the ocean up, can be the most effective. So I think both of those rivers are really exciting processes. And then we're also working up at the Third Herring Brook. As mentioned, we removed 3 dams along Third Herring Brook and a couple of weirs. And then the last piece is creating a fish ladder up at Jacob's Pond, which is the headwaters, and that will allow fish to get all the way into that pond for spawning and open another 60 or so acres of habitat. So they're all really exciting, and again, at very different phases. And we'll continue to look for opportunities within the watershed. There's plenty. And, we'll keep kind of following these while we can. And as I said, looking for new opportunities. So I'm not sure what will be next, but this is where we are right now.
Yeah. For my pure curiosity, how does the grant process or trying to acquire funding process when you're tackling a project? Because I'm assuming it's not really, especially in today's economy, it's not a cheap feat.
It's not, no, and that's another point that we didn't really talk too much about, which are the costs of these projects. The Luddens Ford dam, some of these dams are in poor condition and will need to be repaired, and ideally would be rebuilt so that they would match today's climate and be brought up to today's engineering standards. So there isn't, the ARPA funding was a huge influx of money for infrastructure that was kind of a one-off, right? And so there isn't a lot of money specifically for infrastructure, but there is money for habitat restoration because I think governments and corporations and people who give anonymous grants are seeing the need for reconnecting these habitats and restoring habitats in order to restore the health of the planet. I mean, bit by little bit, right? So there's a lot of funding available for habitat restoration. So, we look at fish passage programs. There are a number of those. Because, we've done a lot of work in the oceans with regulations around bycatch and quotas and things like that to bring back stock fisheries in the oceans. But if the smaller fish that those larger recreational fish or those larger fish feed on can't get to their spawning grounds and can't spawn and then can't have more fish to feed those larger fish, all of that work in the ocean isn't going to get as far as it could. So the oceans and the river systems are all connected. So there seems to be a really big push right now to start, not now, but for the last number of years to really offer opportunities for those migratory fish to be able to complete their cycle. So the fish passage programs, there's coastal resilience grants. So those are grants to fund projects that will increase coastal communities' abilities to respond and adapt to climate change, the impacts of climate change. So removing dams, as we talked about before, creates additional floodwater storage, does a lot to increase community resilience to climate change. So those are some grants that we look at. And then there are, other like park-related grants that sometimes you get to restore parklands around in the areas. So yeah, you really just have to be really looking for, there's a dam and seawall grant program through the state. So you really just need to understand what's available, figure out what makes sense, what is your project eligible for, where would you be a good candidate, and then you would apply for the funding there. As I said, there's a lot of funding right now for habitat restoration. So we're really happy to get what we have so far for the South River project. And we'll continue trying to work to those projects once they're in that construction phase. That's when funders are really excited to provide money so that you can complete it, right? It takes years to get to that point, and then funders will give you money to implement the construction of it. But you have organizations like the Watershed Association and similar organizations that part of their mission and part of their work is to fund kind of the background piece of it. So all the work that leads up to the construction as well. So it's usually a combination of grant funding and nonprofit funding.
Wait, just kind of to take a gist of it from my understanding. If a dam gets breached, the town is responsible.
The dam owner would be responsible.
The dam owner is responsible, but the town is...
If the town is the owner. So in the case of the Indian Head River, the town is the owner.
Yeah.
The dams we removed along the Third Herring Brook, those were privately owned. Some are privately owned by residents, some are privately owned by businesses. So there's all different models for dam ownership.
Wait, business can own dams?
Yeah, if it's on the property.
Oh.
It's typically property-based.
Oh.
Yeah.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought all dams were owned by the government or the town.
Oh, no. Nope. Well, so think about these dams were built, right, for companies. So they initially started out as being privately held, privately owned dam. But then as those businesses went away, then the towns usually absorb them. But in some cases, they're still on private property, whether it's a residential property or a commercial property.
I think that one was actually a nice.
Appropriate nice.
Yeah, the appropriate nice. Question.
Okay.
Do you have any, if you want a last message, or you want to community service?
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that while there is so much happening on a global scale, these projects like these, reconnecting and restoring our rivers, are things that we really can do locally and have a significant impact. I think when it gets overwhelming of, oh gosh, what can I do? The planet's going to explode. These are the things that people can do. Get out there, get educated, inform yourself, make your own decisions, and share that with your networks. I really do think that's important, and we see that as being a very effective tool. especially coming into the spring. There are lots of great events around herring runs and at parks and ways to get out and learn about a lot more of these issues. So I definitely encourage people to do that. Get out and enjoy the rivers, really. You know, there are races along the rivers. There are just a ton of great stuff that happens in the spring. So I highly encourage people to get out there. I encourage people in this area to go check out local herring runs. Spring migration is at its height, usually around April break week. Mm-hmm. So for people to go and take a look and watch these fish try to get up the ladders, it's unbelievable. So yeah, just get out there and explore and learn, and really do have know that you can make a difference, as small as it may seem. The more we all do of it, the bigger that impact.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. The following conversation will be with Becky Malamut. It was nice meeting you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for the opportunity.